I'm David Feith. I'm an op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal, where I work with my colleagues to curate, commission, and to edit the op-eds that appear in the newspaper 6 days a week. Before that, I was an editor at Foreign Affairs magazine, but I'm very much a student of all this, not a veteran of the field, and so I thought, with that, I would share a few thoughts. I appreciate the invitation of the Center for Security Policy, and it's a really unusual privilege to be on a panel with Bill Gertz and with Sara Carter. The first thought that I thought to share is that I'm actually skeptical of whether there is pervasive anti-military bias in the national security reporting of the mainstream media. There's no doubt that journalists often report in politicized ways that ought to be recognized and criticized. But my sense is that these journalists' motivations aren't anti-military as much as they're simply political or philosophical. In saying this, I don't mean to let the media off the hook, certainly. Politicized reporting is bad and often reveals a hypocrisy that is unprofessional. Consider the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, the al-Qaeda leader in Yemen. We don't have a perfectly controlled experiment, of course, but one gets the sense that had the Bush administration or a McCain administration authorized the assassination of an American citizen, there might have been more pointed coverage of the matter by journalists than we've seen in the wake of the Obama administration's authorization of the assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen. Another example from outside the realm of national security, around this time last year, the ClimateGate controversy was brewing. A series of emails had revealed that leading climate scientists had cooked the books on various academic studies of climate change. At the time, the New York Times wrote the following, I quote, "The documents," these emails, "the documents appear to have been acquired illegally and contain all manner of private information and statements that were never intended for the public eye, so they won't be posted here." A year later, in the era of WikiLeaks, that's a bit rich. WikiLeaks revealed another delicious bit of hypocrisy. A few years ago, as I'm sure we all remember, the media was going nuts over the case of Valerie Plame, the CIA official whose secret identity was supposedly outed by the Bush White House. Of course, we now know that the Bush White House did no such thing, but in any case, it's interesting to see how attitudes on the disclosure of national security secrets change over time, a factor of political opportunism among politicians, commentators, and reporters. Now, there can be connections, certainly, between politicized reporting and anti-military reporting. At times, it seems the conscious or subconscious political motivations of reporters can lead them to reporting that is anti-military in effect, if not in intent. That seems to have been the case, for example, with reporting about the so-called Haditha massacre in 2005, when Marines were accused of killing 24 innocent Iraqis. In that case, accurate, deliberate reporting seems to have been a casualty of some journalists' desire to portray the Iraq War as barbarous and hopeless. There was another example earlier in 2005 when Newsweek reported falsely that US troops at Guantanamo Bay had flushed a Quran down a toilet. It's certainly conceivable that the sloppy reporting, which led to deadly riots in Afghanistan, resulted from some journalists' eagerness to further undercut the Bush administration's approach to detainees and to the war on terror generally. These cases, though, might be the exceptions that prove the rule. The cases of Haditha and of the supposed Quran desecration certainly made soldiers appear villainous. But I think that a more general analysis of the media actually yields a conclusion that there isn't pervasive anti-military bias. In this sense, it seems to be that there's an enormous difference between our era today and the Vietnam era. And I think that's seen across the media, in elite media and otherwise, and on college campuses and elsewhere. These days, soldiers are not spit on, and they aren't afraid to walk across campus with their uniforms on, as they were in the 1970s. Now, the situation is complicated at best. There are matters like the refusal of various universities to have ROTC on campus, and maybe we can discuss whether that's a reflection of simply political animus toward the military, or whether the explanation that the universities give, which is that they'll bring the military back as soon as the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy is repealed, is a justification that changes the matter. But either way, the sense from someone who's been on a college campus just recently is that there is just no comparison to the treatment that there once was. And in fact, I think it might be worth considering praising the cultural effects of the support the troops concept. Some people certainly might deploy that line cynically. But whatever the motive, my sense is that cynicism would be a minority view among those who talk about it, and that by and large, that concept has actually pervaded the culture in a very positive way. People do, in fact, separate the troops from the policy, and that's a healthy thing. There isn't a view, as there was in some major quarters 30 years ago, that soldiers are guilty of fighting the wars that they bravely and heroically do. In fact, American servicemen and women are rightfully held in a position of honor across the culture, even in elite media, as when Time magazine unironically named the American Soldier Person of the Year in 2003. In fact, we actually sometimes hear media critics criticizing reporters not for slandering soldiers, but for infantilizing them. The reporter's supposed motive in this case is to criticize the military's political masters in Washington for devising bad policy that endangers troops. So it seems that it poses a question of which is it? Is it that the media are anti-military, or that they infantilize the military? As before, I think that what we see in these cases are journalists that are often political actors. But they're driven not by anti-military animus, but by feelings, political feelings, about wars, presidents, and parties. Not a defense, certainly, of politicized reporting, but I think a distinction that might be worth considering between just what it is that motivates journalists and what it is that affects the culture of mainstream national journalism reporting. I also think that it's interesting to consider broadly this idea of bias. I don't think it's right that journalists should be expected to have no personal biases, no personal opinions on the subjects they cover. The kind of people who are really objective on a subject, who are without personal opinions, are people who don't know the subject and don't care about it. We want reporters to be smart and thoughtful and to know their beats. And it seems that anyone who is smart and thoughtful and covering a certain subject will have opinions about it, as all of us do. It doesn't mean that they can't be good journalists. The question for a journalist, it seems, isn't whether you have zero political biases. The question, I think, is whether you're attuned to your opinions. Are you attuned to the contrary views of other people? Or do you indulge your biases and not take into account other people's views? A good journalist, it seems, might, as a matter of personal opinion, think that certain things are especially newsworthy. But he also knows that other people think that other events or angles are newsworthy, and he or she, of course, reports accordingly. If they simply indulge their biases, journalists can still almost always write stories that are technically factual or true. A journalist who wants to write only about the brutality of the military will be able to find facts to support his or her argument. And a journalist who wants to write only about humanitarian heroism will likewise be able to find material. But a good journalist, it seems, grasps the context of a subject and captures for the reader which way the wind is blowing. That's not easy or mechanical. It requires exercising judgment about complicated situations, figuring out trends, and figuring out what is most relevant about certain complicated issues. It's that process, which is a subjective process, that we hope isn't dominated by personal political views or ideology. One example of this might be the surge in Iraq. At its beginning, many reporters were invested in a certain narrative about the Iraq War. We're all familiar with what that was. In turn, it seems they were slow to recognize the importance of various positive trends that began in Iraq starting, let's say, around the summer of 2007. So the job of reporting on some of those early positive signs fell to Ken Pollack and Michael O'Hanlon, for example, in a very significant New York Times op-ed in July, I think, of 2007, and to others like John McCain, who were actually at the time ridiculed across the media for being credulous. When it comes to understanding the role of bias in reporting, it might be helpful to think not in terms of biased versus unbiased or truth versus untruth, but in terms of competing worldviews. Different news organizations might assess the same issues differently based on differences in the worldviews of the reporters or the institutions involved. So someone at CNN, for example, might be interested in an economic story about income inequality, while someone at Fox News is not interested by that. At Fox, they might choose to report about how a rising economic tide lifts all boats, or about how well off the poor are in our era today relative to past eras. Both reports may be accurate and truthful, but of course they manifest different worldviews that will appeal to different audiences, and that over time will prove either more or less insightful, either a better or a further away capturing of the essence of things, of the way the wind is blowing, of what's really essential in the broad, complicated fields that journalists cover. And I think we can think of this in terms, certainly, of the national security field. So take the New START treaty. Certain news outlets have addressed New START in the way the White House has. They've talked about it in terms of the Obama administration's broader goal of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. And in doing so, they've affected the understanding of readers, and presumably gotten some readers to think about the treaty in just those terms. And the treaty then would be appealing to readers who like the idea of nuclear zero. Other news outlets have reported on New START in a different context. In the context not of nuclear zero, which reporters at those outlets might consider a dangerous idea in the first place, and one not really centrally tied to the treaty with Russia, but they've reported on New START in the context of decades of arms control agreements with the Soviet Union and with Russia. Agreements, of course, on which the Soviets and the Russians cheated, and which failed to achieve great advances in international peace. So, for example, Bill Gertz in July wrote a great article in the Washington Times about a State Department report showing that Russia had cheated on the original START agreement from the get-go. That's a topic, unfortunately, that other news organizations would have considered less relevant, not germane to this ongoing New START subject. That example, it seems, can be useful to those, like the Center for Security Policy, who are interested in shaping opinions. Charges of bias, it seems, can often fall on deaf ears because they're taken as complaints just from people who have other biases. But it seems that what might have practical effect is to focus on this matter of context and to work, as certain think tanks and others do, to inject into the public debate information that people in news organizations might otherwise have missed. Like, for example, that a new nuclear arms control treaty with Russia should be understood not in terms of nuclear zero, or not primarily in those terms, but in terms of a long history of arms control agreements that proved susceptible to cheating and futile. I know that's a role that the Wall Street Journal opinion pages try to play, and so do many in this room. And as we heard at the beginning, this matter is really, it seems, a crucial part of maintaining an informed citizenry, which in turn is just about the most important part of the American political experiment of keeping the republic, as Ben Franklin said long ago. So I know that I appreciate the privilege to speak and to hear hear Bill Gertz and Sara further. Thank you.